Shall we start, sir?
Yeah.
Very good afternoon to all of you. The topic for today is enterprise risk management, and the panelists for today are Ms. Deepti Barera and C. Anupam Saraf. And I take this opportunity to welcome our chairman, C. Anuj Goyalji, who is the chairman of Committee on Management Accounting, and he is also the chairman of Research Committee, which is the oldest technical committee of ICAI. I have very pleasure to inform all of you that this is the fifth term of C. Anuj Goyalji in the council. He has got 14 years in the council, 3 years in regional council and 6 years in the branch. He was also the chairman of Central India Regional Council. At the academic front, he is a meritorious scholar possessing qualification of all the three institutes, that is Chartered Accountant, CS and ICWA. He is also LLM, MCOM, DSA and DRA. And on the top of it, he is running an educational institute, so he is a hardcore educationist, and that is why all these new topics which this committee is introducing, it is because of his guidance, inspiration and efforts that the committee is able to do these webinars on latest topics which will be very useful to the members. With this brief introduction, may I request Chairman Sir to kindly take the proceeding of the session? Chairman Sir, thank you sir.
Important webinar on the nation, enterprise persons, Deepti Barera ji, and having the best of the resource person. And it is very, very important for the profession, for the trade and industry, and for the nation. And as now we are committed, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India is committed towards the Atmanirbhar Bharat mission of the Prime Minister Modi, and with the of business across the globe, and practically no can really go ahead unless and until there is very, very active contribution of the members of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. I think this enterprise risk management is one of the very, very important topic, and I'm quite confident that with the deliberation of Deepti Barera ji and Anupam ji, we will be in the best position to really learn the enterprise risk management. Our Secretariat, Surinder Palji, Vasali Jagdiji and other officers are doing their level best to see that how the chartered accountants who are having the expertise in the management accounting, cost and management accounting, how we can really sharpen our skills on the time-to-time basis. And now business finance course, diploma in management and business finance course. Am I audible, Surinder ji?
Recording has started.
सर थोड़ा सा डिस्कनेक्ट हो रहा है, अदरवाइज इट्स you're audible but बीच बीच में
वॉइस में प्रॉब्लम आ रही है सर.
हाँ जी.
Yeah, and enterprise risk management friends involves managing, protecting an organization's ability to meet its goals regardless of the types of risks being considered. And now, as the chartered accountants have proved that not only they can be the best of the CFO but also the CEO. And we are trying our level best that how we chartered accountants can prove ourselves as the best chief executive officers of best. And through the enterprise risk management, through this DMBF course, diploma in business finance course, we are trying our level best. We can have the best of the chartered accountants who can contribute in the best possible manner for the trade and industry as the chief executive officers. That the enterprise is important not only for the industry but we are having n number of chartered accountants who are running. When we do talk of the practicing chartered accountants, now the role of the practicing chartered accountants also changing. We are now from the compliance work. We are moving from the attest function which we were to business solution provider, and I think with chartered accountants, the Indian industry can't really go ahead. So I'm quite confident that the practicing chartered accountants will certainly that how really at our level best to see that how we can hold the trade and industry, how we can have the best of the export oriented units, number one. Have the goods industry, and I'm quite confident. Would be much about this management, but I have requested to both the speakers as now we have this crisis. Something about this enterprise risk management according to the changed circumstances of the COVID-19, so that we can help out in the trade and industry, specifically in this time of crisis. Without taking your further time, I welcome Deepti Barera, who is an associate director with the risk advisory practice of one of the most prominent chartered accountant firm, and she is focusing on enterprise risk management and corporate governance. Consulting experience risk and consumer and industrial products and oil and energy for clients across. I had a brief history Adidas groups in India, and she is of course MBA, PG diploma in cyber law, certified program from the Texas School of Strategy and Innovation and Information System Auditor, ICAI, in 2012 also. So without taking your further time, I once again welcome our having Anupam ji, who is manager with the risk advisory, focusing on enterprise risk management, strategic risk management, and corporate governance services. With more than 8 years of experience, Anupam ji has worked on various engagements: enterprise risk management engagements, risk maturity assessment, internal financial controls, process governance, and compliance management framework. He also worked in American Express as a manager in the third-party due diligence and operational risk management business units. With this, I once again welcome Deepti Barera ji and Sri Anupam Saraf, and I am confident that this webinar on enterprise risk management will be very, very useful for the members of the institute, both who are in practice as well as for the members of the institute who are in industry. Thank you very much, friends. Thank you very much. So I will request Deepti Barera ji first to have her deliberation, please. Deepti ji, please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself, Deepti. Deepti ji, please unmute yourself.
Yeah. So thank you so much, everyone. My name is Deepti Barera, and thank you, sir, for the introduction. And I would like to thank the Institute and its leadership for giving us this opportunity to talk to all of you today on this very important topic of enterprise risk management. As sir introduced both of us, I have my colleague Anupam Saraf with me, and my name is Deepti Barera. I'm an associate director with one of the big four consulting firms here. Been associated with this firm for a little over 10 years, and have about 12 years of experience in the risk management space overall. I have my colleague Anupam Saraf, who's a chartered accountant and has been associated with our firm and the practice for the last 5 years and has about 8 years of experience in risk management. Very happy to talk to all of you, and we'd like to thank once again the Institute, Anuj Goyal sir, all of you to give us this opportunity to come here, talk about risk management, risk and risk management, which has become a very important topic in the current scenario. All of us are living in a scenario which seems like somebody has made a Netflix show out of our current lives, but and that kind of really emphasizes on the understanding of risk and risk management. It has become more and more important for professionals like all of us. And it's important that we spend some time understanding the concepts, see how we can utilize that in our current, space of experience in the way that we are working in our respective organizations. So what we'll do over the next 1.5 hours, how we've divided our time, and Anupam and I will talk about the concepts of risk and risk management. What are some of the globally accepted models of risk management, and how do we see the future of risk emerging? As we said that there are lots of changes coming in the way risk and controls and our practice is looked upon, and how we can really utilize to do an optimal utilization of risk management techniques to better our business performance, our performance individually as professionals. So to start with, Anupam, and let's move on to the next next slide. I would like to talk about. There is an analogy that I would like to draw from the Formula One racing. They always say that what kind of cars have the best kind of brakes or the braking system. The answer is Formula One racing cars. Reason being, they are the ones that have to move the fastest. So they have to have the best kind of control system, the best kind of mechanism to stop them, to keep them in control. Basically, why I'm quoting this example is that ERM, or enterprise risk management as a practice, is any organization's braking system. It is basically a mechanism that helps you go faster but stay in control. It's not a mechanism to stop you from doing something. It's not a mechanism that will result in your operations being stopped, being controlled. It is basically a mechanism that will help you go much, much more faster, yet stay in control, because it will help you understand where could be our roadblocks, what are our risks, and how do we really control them. And we make sure that we are making optimal utilization of all our resources while we are running faster and trying to achieve greater heights as an organization. So basically, how do we define risk? It's a term which is very commonly used in our regular lives. I'm sure all of you who are there on the webinar would have used this term almost on a regular basis on various kinds of scenarios. But, how do you really define risk? What we say for an organization, risk is the possibility that events will occur and affect the achievement of the objectives of the organization. Now, I'm not saying they will have a negative effect only. They can also have a positive effect. It is basically saying that how uncertainty of any kind can have any impact on achievement of certain objectives. Now, and all of us deal with financial markets, all of us deal with trading. We are aware of how we take risks to get down to higher objectives. And thus we really understand that how it's important to understand that it is not just the negative side of this word that we really need to look at. There are a lot of positives that can come up if risks are taken in the right manner. So if you see what you see there are a certain approach that an organization has to achieve its objectives. Without risk, if there are no risks for an organization, you straight away go and achieve those objectives. But that's not how a real environment will work. You will have lots of internal, external scenarios which will actually have a lot of effect on the way you are approaching any activity, any business process in your organization. So, like the current pandemic that we are all living with. it's an external scenario a lot of people had not thought of. We had not thought of that something like this will happen. We had certain plans, we had certain plans to achieve certain EBITDA, certain profit levels for our organizations, even for our personal lives, get promoted, achieve a certain level in our professions. There were hundreds of plans that we all have, but there are risks or uncertainties that come from external or internal environment on the organization. And the idea of risk management is to say that how do we manage these external, internal uncertainties, reduce the effect in an appropriate manner, control, and ensure that we are able to achieve our objectives to the optimal level. It is about preempting certain scenarios. It is about thinking what can go wrong. Risk management is all about thinking what can go wrong and then try and implement mitigation mechanisms or be ready with contingency plans so that when actually that event occurs, you are able to control it in the right fashion. So, and Anupam, let's go to the next slide, which kind of defines what is enterprise risk management. Enterprise risk management, as I said, is a culmination of a lot of activities that an organization does. And to understand what kind of risks we can face when we are performing our regular business operations, when we are executing a business process, when we are setting a new strategy for the organization, what kind of risks can emerge? How can we really reduce their effect on our organization by mitigating them or transferring them to a third party in the optimal manner? And then if there are certain risks which we are not able to really mitigate, control before they actually occur, the idea is that we have contingency plans. We have plan B ready, that if this really happens, what will I do? So it's about just inculcating this entire aspect of thinking, making decisions by understanding risks in those decisions and then implementing it across our organization. Just building that entire culture and capabilities and integrated with our strategy setting and regular business operations. That's all that enterprise risk management is about, and ensuring that there is an end goal that we have to achieve and we are able to meet that, we are able to reach to that end goal in the optimal manner and the organization benefits. Next one, please, Anupam. Yeah. Now, risk management as a practice has also been evolving significantly over the last few years, and there are lots of elements that have resulted in risk management evolving. There are, of course, the regulatory aspect, which we will talk about in the next coming slides. But over the last decade or so, risk management was earlier, as I said, it was a very siloed exercise. Some organization will look at some function will look at certain risks in their operations. There was no ownership really defined for risk inside the organization. When we face it, we try and, manage it. It was always seen as a negative impact on the business. Then we saw an integrated way of doing risk management where we started realizing that risk is a collective responsibility. Risk management in an organization is a collective responsibility. Individually, one finance function or one compliance or legal function cannot manage these. It has to be inculcated by business operations, by marketing, by the line functions of an organization to collectively look at both positive as well as negative sides of any risks that can come in our organization and then try and manage them. And that's when this emergence of enterprise risk management happened, because enterprise risk management now even takes a step further and asks the organization that decision making in your business, every strategy that you're making, every new market that you're entering into, have you looked at what are the risks that can result out of this strategy or the risks that can come up in implementation of this strategy? It is embedded in the organization's regular operations. It is called as a risk intelligent culture, is what we call in our consulting parlance. But it's all about looking at risk before you do any major decisions for the organization, looking at operational risks when you're executing a process. And that's where the idea of control comes into picture, that in our regular business operations, do we have identified risks, implemented controls against it? And when we are looking at new strategies, how are we looking at risks around that? And that is how been the entire journey of risk management, which has also resulted in because of certain regulatory requirements. Anupam?
Yeah. Yeah. So just take a step back. Over the year, the requirement of the risk management has evolved in India. So the first time when the risk management was mandated was in the year 2009. So the journey of risk management has like the requirement was largely driven by two factors. One was the regulatory requirement, and as also the global mandate from the organization. There was a need to have a robust risk management framework. So from India's standpoint, the first mandate was from the listing agreement in 2009, which was issued by the MCA, where there was an increased focus on the corporate governance. And then we just moved to 2013. There was a major overhauling of the Companies Act from 1956 to 2013, and where the focus was more on the role of the board and the audit committee to have an oversight role on the risk management. In parallel, the SEBI came out with their own guidelines, focusing more on the risk management committee to be formed by certain class of companies, and the listed companies are required to comply with the regulatory requirements. In parallel, the COSO and the ISO framework, they also came out with the revised standard, focusing on the strategy, performance, the value creation. So in the last 10 years, primarily the focus on risk management has increased, and the organization is also focusing on the requirement of the risk management to build a resilience within the organization. And of late, the recent amendment was through the Kotak Committee, where the LODR 2015 was amended to amendment in 2018, where the requirement of complying with the regulatory requirement from top 100 listed companies changed to 2015. So this is the overall journey we had for the risk management in the past 10 years. So starting from the regulatory requirement for risk management in India, primarily there are three areas which focus on the regulatory requirement in India. The first is the Companies Act, second is the SEBI LODR, and third is the DP guideline. So from the theme perspective, all the three regulatory requirement is talking about the same thing, though their applicability may be on different set of companies or different requirement, but the overall theme of the three regulatory requirements we have in India is to have a oversight function and to have a robust risk management framework. As we move to the Companies Act, in Companies Act, broadly it's focusing on the board of directors role in order to ensure that the company has a robust risk management policy framework, and there is a direct oversight by the independent directors and the directors of the company on the risk management framework. Also, the audit committee is supposed to evaluate the risk management system in the organization. So the Companies Act is primarily focusing on the board of directors and the audit committee to have an oversight role in order to ensure that the company has a robust risk management policy and framework. Moving on to the regulatory SEBI LODR. So again, this focus on the similar thing, which is the policy system, the risk appetite of the organization. The new thing which was introduced, as I spoke earlier, on 2018 by Kotak Committee, where it was mandated for certain class of companies to have a risk management committee, which should consist of majority of the board members. So the accountability of the board member increased. It should not be a steering committee or executive committee, but it should be the risk management committee, usually formed by the board members. And also it mandated that the risk management committee should meet at least once in a year and focus on the cyber security risk. And the class of the companies from top 100 company was mandated to top 500 company, which got effective the beginning of the last financial year on 1st April 2019. The third regulatory requirement, which is the Department of Public Enterprise. So this is applicable only for certain public sector enterprise who are required to adhere with the DP guidelines. So DP guidelines was primarily focusing on enhancing the requirement of the corporate governance procedures. And again, this talks about the same thing, which is the risk minimization procedures, the oversight function, and the collective responsibility of the risk management. So along with the board, it's responsibility of every employees and the members of the organization to ensure that the company is able to identify the risk which surrounds the organization and the function, and they're able to mitigate those risks by applying the minimization procedures.
Yeah. So, there are certain building blocks for any organization to have as basis of an enterprise risk management program. When you're looking at developing a program for yourself, these are what we call as the 6 integrated or the key building blocks or key pillars for an enterprise risk management program for an organization. And Anupam just spoke about all the regulatory requirements there in India to risk management. One common theme that emerges out of that is having the responsibility on the board and the senior management of the organization to look at risks. And that's where the element of governance of risk comes into picture. The big principle of risk management and the basic requirement is to have a strong governance mechanism where the board, the audit committee, through in order to grow. And, and you would have seen organizations which are startups will be very they are risk takers to a great extent because they are in their growth phase. But when there are organizations who are more established, they have become bigger brands, their risk management techniques are more calculated, more detailed. They will have greater emphasis on how do you mitigate risk, because there is a huge underlying brand reputation, shareholders, expectations that are lying into that organization. And that's where this governance comes into place, that how is it that our board, our senior management is going to define how we will take risks. And that becomes the strong foundation for a risk management exercise. The next building block is, of course, the risk management process and systems. What are the processes that you are building in your organization to manage risks? What is the periodicity with which you will review your risks? How is risk inculcated into the business as risk ownership given to the business heads, to functional teams, and how that entire process of review, reporting to the board will run? We will talk about in subsequent slides a bit more in detail on how this entire process is explained. But that forms the second element. And you'll see it says risk management process and systems because, in today's date, technology has become a very important aspect of any process in an organization. So you need to have robust systems which can support the risk management process, and how enabling it through technology, organizations are further taking advantage of management processes. The next building block is, block number 3, 4, and 5 is what you will see are the ways we identify risks in our business. Operational discipline talks about ERM for your business as usual. When you're looking at risks for regular operations of your business, how just by the mere existence of us as an organization and doing our daily jobs and responsibilities, there are a multitude of risks that are associated with your operations. And operational discipline and risk management around that is all about identifying those risks in your regular operations in various categories, and then having a mechanism to monitor, mitigate them, and or have contingency plans. Block number 4, which is about successfully delivering change. This is where we talk about risks of strategy. Whenever you look at changing anything in your organization, whenever you look at taking up a new project, going into a new market, launching a new product, doing a partnership or an acquisition, what are the risks that you can take upon yourself by doing these transactions? Or what are the risks that you may face when you're actually executing this change for your organization is what comes into this block number 4. The idea is to, before you take this decision, you look at them and make sure that you are reducing their impact and minimizing them to an optimal level. 5th block is about managing high impact events. One high impact event is what we are living with today. The idea is that during our risk identification exercise, we identify these kind of black swan scenarios or known unknown scenarios which can really come and hit us badly and can have a very high impact on the organization's existence. These may be scenarios which are very low in likelihood, but they can have, if they happen, they can have catastrophic effects on us as an organization. And the idea is that we look at them and we try to have mechanisms to have, to be ready to operate in these kind of contingencies and crisis scenarios. So the idea is to integrate your risk management process with crisis management. And the last one is about integrated assurance. Now, no process, no activity will suffice if there is no assurance over the fact that it is working well. So the idea is, how do you also integrate risk management with assurance activities like internal audit in your organization? So you look at the right set of risks, make sure that their mitigation investments that we do in mitigating risks are audited. And the board and the governing bodies of the organization get an assurance that yes, this program of risk management is working well in the organization, or does it need some overhauling or some oiling in certain aspects. And that's what this integrated assurance block will help in implementing a strong framework for the organization. Next one, please, Amit. Now, we spoke about having a strong governance model. The regulatory bodies in India also mandate certain governance responsibilities on the board and its committees, audit committee and the risk management committee. And the idea is that we have a top-down as well as a bottom-up flow of risk and risk management activities. From top-down, we set the entire aspect of how we will manage risks. What is our stand towards managing risk as an organization? Are we going to be very risk averse? Are we going to be very risk, big risk takers, or are we going to, take a mid-level approach towards risk, taking risks in the organization, and how the entire program, the entire oversight will run. So if you see, the top-down approach is all about providing guidance, providing the focus, and providing the entire aspect of how we will be looking at risks as an organization. The middle management comes into picture, where we have the risk owners really sitting, the business units, the functional risk management team of the organization is where we have the entire process of risk management that will run. How will we identify our risks? Who will own them? How will we mitigate them? What will be the process of aggregating risks at an enterprise level? So, you have different business units, different functions which are spread out across the country. One risk in isolation in one business unit may not have that big an impact. But if you look at the entire aggregation of risk for an organization, it may have a bigger impact. So the idea of an enterprise risk management activity is to share information, not do our risk management practices in isolation, but set up a committee, set up a forum of the management team members as well as the risk owners who are from the middle management or the process ownership level, to actually share their lessons, connect the dots, and see if there can be any best practices or learnings that we can have from each other. So the entire flow of organizational risk mitigation plans, risk programs will happen bottom up, and the entire guidance will flow from top to down, from the board of directors to the functional teams, on how do we look at risk management in the organization. Next one, Anupam, please. Yeah. Now, a very important point comes in, and what kind of risks do we really look at as an organization? There can be various, as I said in the starting, risks cannot be always negative, and risks cannot be always some things that only come to us from the outside. There are lots of risks that can give us, if we manage them in the right way and take the risks intelligently, can have a positive effect on our operations. So anything that market rewards is how we define it, are called as rewarded risks. So the expected reward that you get if you take a risk and the value to an organization increases, it is a rewarded risk. These are generally called as calculated risk, is what you see in the circle on the screen, which are risks that result from certain strategic choices, certain calculations that we do as an organization, and invest in something or take a decision which will help me grow my business. So, as we were talking about new markets, new strategies, adoption of new technology, going for an ERP implementation, these are calculated risks that you've taken. You've made an investment, you've You're going into a change mechanism for your organization to reward yourself in a certain fashion, either monetarily or increasing efficiency of your business. The idea is to reward, and these calculated risks are also, if you'll see, there is a line of controllability. Generally, the calculated risks, if you calculate them well, if you plan them well, are more controllable risks for an organization, because you are deciding your course of action by weighing all the risks and opportunities that can occur in that entire scenario. So calculated risk is the first bucket. Then what you'll see is something called as imposed risks. These are generally risks that originate from external factors, and they are uncontrollable or unavoidable. You may not be able to do anything about it. All you can do is monitor them, keep a check on them, and have a plan ready. So a regulatory change coming in, you may be able to speak to the regulators, put in your point of view, tell them how good or bad that regulation change might be. But the decision is not in your hands. You will not be able to control if they still come out with that regulatory decision. It may harm your organization. It may benefit your organization, significantly. But these are risks that originate externally, and you will have to keep an eye on them. What we are facing right now, which is the COVID-19 pandemic, is also an imposed risk on the world. Not on an organization, but the entire world. We are all facing this. It is a catastrophe that has happened. It's a pandemic that has resulted in operations stopping. But the lesson that we can all learn from this is how we need to be ready if this kind of a scenario comes in future. What the lockdown taught us, how to start operating with masks on, with social distancing, and that is what we will learn, because if this comes up again, we will be able to manage it. When demonetization happened, it was an imposed scenario for us personally and for a lot of organizations. And now we have learned from it. We have gone to digital ways of payments, and we have evolved from the scenario that if tomorrow again a demonetization scenario happens, we will not be in the same fashion as we were earlier. So these imposed risks, you may not be able to control, but you can learn from them and learn to manage, or learn from the others who have faced it. And the idea is to be ready with a plan when they actually happen, and continue to monitor them. The last one is, which is the most common, Anupam, stay on the same slide, please. Yeah. The last one, which is called as self-inflicted risks. This is what, we have seen. If you look at any organization's portfolio of risks, you will find a lot of risks are self-inflicted risks, because these are risks which actually happen or result from your day-to-day operations, day-to-day decisions, your behavior of, your operations and your employees. And these are generally that happen because of gaps in your compliance process, or poor judgment in your business, or a decision gone wrong, or somebody not following a process. And you'll also see they are below the axis of reward and unreward, and most of these are unrewarded risks. Self-inflicted risks, which are caused by us because of poor judgment, because of gaps in our compliance processes, will generally result in losses, penalties, fines, license cancellations for the organization. And you'll also see the controllability factor of self-inflicted risks is the highest. The idea is that we can control most of these risks by our processes and controls. We have internal controls mechanisms, we have operational controls, we have compliance frameworks in organizations. They are mostly to cater to these self-inflicted risks. The SOPs that we follow, the control matrices and risk and control matrices that we follow, the accounting standards that we follow. The idea is to not get into this bucket of self-inflicted risks, control them in the best way possible, because they are nothing but the negative risk that we keep talking about. They will only result in losses for the organization, and we should reduce them to the extent possible. So an ERM is all about looking at all these buckets of risk and managing them in the right way, so that the organization benefits from its risk management exercise and is able to reduce the unrewarded risks and increase the rewarded side of risk for the business. Next move on.
So, in this slide, we are covering on the
Yeah.
So in this slide, we are covering about the risk domains. So primarily, we have categorized the risk into 5 major domains. So the type of domain which may apply to a particular organization, like the size, it depends on the size and the nature of the organization, nature for the operation of the organization. So right now we have classified into 5 domains. Organization may have 7 or 8 more domains. It totally depends how they have classified the risk in their risk register. Talking about the risk domain, the first domain is the strategic and reputation. Taking a clue from the previous slide, which talks about the calculated risk. So majority of the strategic risk would talk about would fall under the calculated risk. So if from the strategic standpoint, if we are not calculating what strategy we are taking is in the right direction, what is the assumption behind our strategic from example perspective, the business model of the organization. It's very important that we do a thorough analysis what kind of assumptions we have in our business model. So there are multiple subdomains which talks about the government policies, non-renewal license. So if we are having a license and from the strategic standpoint, we want to renew that license or not. So all the risk which from the strategic standpoint for the organization will fall under this bucket. And the second subdomain of it is the reputational risk. Tomorrow, if a event happens from the social media point of view and the brand of the organization gets hit due to an unfortunate event, the public image of the organization goes for a toss. So any risk which will lead to a reputational impact will also lead to a risk event to the organization. The second domain we talk about is the financial risk, which focuses more on the working capital requirement. There is a lack of fund to run the operation. The funding is not cost effective, the foreign exchange loss. So this domain will focus on the financial operation of the organization. The third is the regulatory and compliance. So as we understand, the regulatory requirement of the country changes from the period depending on the government we are working in. So new laws get introduced and we are, as an organization, we are supposed to comply with the tax requirement, the labor law, and there are various regulatory requirements which are required to comply to run our operation. So any non-compliance which may lead to stoppage of our operation or lead to penalties and fines, risk associated with those will fall under this bucket. And also if there is an amendment in the law and we fail to comply with that, so there is an uncertainty, a new regulatory requirement may come up and we don't comply with that, and a risk associated with that will fall under this bucket. The next is the operational risk domain. This domain becomes quite critical for a manufacturing organization because there are a lot of operational events which is happening around the manufacturing concern. For example, underutilized capacity. They depend on a lot of third party for contractual labor. Also, the environment, health and safety becomes quite critical because you're supposed to ensure that the labor and the employees who are working in a manufacturing concern operates in a certain environment which is eco-friendly, which is also not hazardous to the health and safety as well. So any operational risk event which leads to stoppage of production will fall under this bucket. The last, which we talks about the technological, becomes quite critical in today's world because as we know in India, we have a data loss and data privacy and protection bill coming up. So a lot of organization in India will get impacted once that law gets implemented in India, and we are supposed to comply with that. So any leakage of information or any breach of data of confidential information due to cyber attack or due to lack of IT governance and risk associated with that will fall under this risk domain. So these are the broad 5 domains, but nevertheless we may have 6 and 7 domains, depends on again from the nature and size of the organizations. Okay, this slide will talk about what should be our approach to manage the risk. So ERM acts as an enabler to ensure that an organization have a consistent approach to manage their risk. Again, over here we are highlighting a 4-step process. The first is to identify. There are various methods to identify the risk from external and internal sources. It could be through workshop, through interview, through questionnaire. And the idea to identify the risk is what is the overall risk universe which may affect the organization to achieve the enterprise. So it becomes an important step that we identify the right set of risks which apply to the organization, which may positively or negatively affect the organization. Because whenever we take risk, there is an opportunity associated with that. So we should also even document that set of risks, because at the end there might be an opportunity which we may try to explore, and there is a risk associated with that. The second step is the assessment and prioritization. We will discuss more in detail in the subsequent slide, but this becomes quite critical because at the end, the organization would like to know what could be the potential impact of that risk, because at the end, if it's not affecting the organization, it's not a risk to the organization. So what is the impact of that risk? And it will also help us to classify and prioritize this risk, because at the end, an organization may have 50 or 40 or 100 set of risks. It's not possible for an organization to mitigate all of them at the same point of time. It's quite critical we know what are our key risks and how we should prioritize them. So the rules and regulation for evaluation has to be documented and consistently applied for all the risks we have identified in our documentation, which is called the risk register. The third step talks about the response strategy. So it's very important that once we identify the risk and we know what are our top risks, we have a risk owner or risk mitigation owner who is accountable at the end to ensure that we have an adequate response strategy. So before we respond to the risk, we need to perform a detailed due diligence around the risk, which may include a root cause analysis, inventory analysis, or scenario analysis to ensure that we are rightly addressing the root cause of the risk. Because when we are defining our response strategy, whether to accept the risk or mitigate the risk or accept or transfer the risk, we need to know what are the root cause or what are the event we are trying to address. So it's important that we have a plan in place to mitigate the risk, and an accountable person would be at the end accountable to ensure that the strategy we have adopted gets implemented on the ground. The fourth step, which is the most crucial step, is to ensure that the whole process is iterative in nature, because at the end we are supposed to monitor the risk and also report it to the senior management. So when we spoke about the governance in our earlier slide, it's important that we report the right set of risks to the top management as well as the board and the audit committee. And also we monitor at a predefined frequency. A high risk may have a greater focus from the management, but a medium and low risk cannot be more. So we need to have a monitoring mechanism, an earning indicator or key risk indicator, which we can assign to each of the risks, which will enable us to see what's the trend around the risk, whether that risk is increasing due to the change in the environment, or we don't see any trend around that particular risk. So monitoring and reporting becomes a very crucial stage in the whole process. So all this 4-step process has to be consistently applied in the entire organization. So the next slide talks about the risk assessment methodology. Dipti?
So, Anupam mentioned that why would we, the idea is that you can have a universe of thousands of risks for your organization, but it's important that we assess them in the right fashion, prioritize them so that we know what risk needs immediate attention. And there are various ways or various assessment criteria that organizations use to assess a risk and then put it on a prioritized heat map, as we call it, for their management to look at. So as we were talking about the entire bottom-up approach that happens in terms of risk, identifying operational level risk at the business process level, to functional risks or functional or business unit level risks at a unit head level, and then going up to the enterprise level. The idea is that we look at these various types of assessment criteria. The first one is the impact of risk. Impact is nothing but what will happen if this risk event materializes. What will I face as an effect on my organization? Will I have financial loss? Will there be a reputation loss? Will I have a regulatory fine penalty? Will my plant be shut down? Or, will any of our management members be penalized or arrested? There can be various types of impact that a risk can have. Generally, it's a combination of various nature of impacts. And in a standard risk management program, what we do is set up a impact scale, which could be a 3-point, 4-point, 5-point scale, which will define that how is the risk appetite for that organization. What do they define as a low risk impact, and what do they define as a very high risk impact? So that impact assessment is one criteria which you would want to assess in prioritizing a risk. The second assessment criteria is vulnerability. Vulnerability is your level of preparedness or adaptability if the risk scenario actually happens. So what is it that you have in your existing processes that has prepared you to face this risk, or that has prepared you to mitigate this risk in a greater fashion? So what is your how exposed are you to if the certain risk happens? And you may have certain, for example, just taking a cyber attack, you will be extremely vulnerable if you don't have a firewall or an antivirus or basic mechanisms of controlling such external attackers or hackers to get into your systems. But if you have these, not that you are completely away from the risk, because they will also have ways to circumvent it, but the stronger the mechanisms that you will have to control a hacking attack on your organization or on your systems, the less vulnerable will you be. So vulnerability is the second scale that organizations look at. Third is likelihood, which is what we call it as the probability or the chances that this risk will occur. In a lot of scenarios, likelihood is assessed looking at historical data if available, or by, in a subjective manner, assessing what are the chances that this risk can happen in the next 1 year, in the next 2 years, or a decade for the organization. In financial sector, we've seen likelihood being assessed a lot more because there's availability of data and numbers. But a lot of operational or strategic risks, you may not be able to assess the likelihood to the T, but there is some level of subjectivity that will come from the business which gets involved here. Another criteria for assessment is what we call as speed of onset or velocity of risk. This is basically defined as the time it will take for the risk event to manifest itself, or the time it will take for you to feel the impact of the risk. So it occurs today. If I feel the impact after 10 days, maybe the velocity is medium. But if the risk occurs right now and the impact is felt in the next few minutes to days, it is a high velocity event. So for example, if there is a risk of fire or a risk of accident that is there in any manufacturing organization, the moment that event materializes or there is a fire, it actually happens, the impact is felt immediately. You will not get a warning that kal aag lagega, and you cannot wait and be prepared for the fire to come and impact you. You will face it immediately. You will have your mechanisms to control it, but the velocity of that risk is extremely high because you will face it immediately. In these kind of scenarios, you need to be ready to control them. So that is the reason while you have fire prevention mechanisms, you also have fire, mechanisms to deal with fire if there is actually a fire. So you will have an extinguisher. While you will make your products or your buildings or your, you will try and do fireproofing, you will do training so that there is no fire, but you will also have mechanisms to control a fire if it happens, because the velocity of that risk is extremely high. You will not get any warning and you need to be ready to control it the moment it happens. So these are some of the assessment criteria that we've seen organizations generally use. A combination of these. Impact into vulnerability or impact into likelihood generally gives you the score of that particular risk. And what you see on the right hand side of the screen is a heat map, is what we call it, is where you place your risks. So high impact, high vulnerability. So the impact of this risk is high and our level of preparedness is low. It is going to be a critical risk for the organization. And the idea is that if your idea of a risk treatment or mitigation mechanism is to reduce either the vulnerability or the impact of this risk. So we try and put on controls, put on processes, put on mechanisms so that we can reduce either or both of these so that what is in the purple moves towards the green. This heat map also helps organizations, senior management or boards to look at what really they need immediate action on, what is something that they can continue to monitor. But, if it really materializes, we will look at it. So if something is high impact, but even though the chances of occurrence might be low, we need to be ready because the impact is going to be catastrophic if it comes in. But, if our level of preparedness is good, the impact might be very high, but we are prepared towards it. So we can continue to only monitor, not take further actions because we've already done a lot to reduce our vulnerability towards that risk. So that's the entire idea of assessing and prioritizing so that you can move to an optimal treatment mechanism for the risk. Anupam, can we move on, please? Yeah. So the idea, as I was saying, to prioritize the risks is to see how will you respond to that risk. There are various types of response mechanisms available to deal with a risk. We call this avoidance. The first one is called as avoidance of risk. Basically, I don't want to get into a transaction, seems very risky. You completely want to avoid getting into any activity because the risk is extremely high. So, you shut down a business unit which is not doing well. You've avoided the further risks. You've already faced certain losses and now this is going to be further resulting in losses. You avoid that. Classic example of avoidance of risk was the lockdown that we are all facing. We're all working from home, a lot of us, because we want to avoid the risk of transmission. The organizations and us as individuals, we want to avoid the risk. And thus we are sitting at home in a controlled environment to not expose ourselves with that risk. The next type of response, what we call as the sharing or transfer of risk. Transfer was the old terminology it was called, but now we've realized you cannot really transfer 100% of risk to a third party. It is a lot of times sharing certain aspects of a risk. Classic example is taking insurance. We take it for ourselves. Organizations take for their organization's existence. Because what you're trying to do is you're sharing. You may not be able to avoid a certain scenario, but you're sharing the financial impact with a third party by insuring yourself. That if it really happens tomorrow, I will at least have the financial backing in form of the insurance claims to come back to my, earlier mechanism. So that's my continuity plan here. The next aspect is of mitigation of risk. Any activity, any control measure that you put in your processes to either reduce the impact or likelihood of a risk from occurring. So basically, mitigation would result in your vulnerability going down towards a certain risk. So you put in various, we spoke about the fire incident. The mitigation mechanisms are you do fireproofing of certain areas, that is to reduce the impact if really a risk occurs. You do trainings, you do drills, you're trying to teach people on how not to use hazardous substances in an uncontrolled manner. All these are examples of trying to reduce likelihood of that fire risk. So mitigation mechanisms can be either result in either reduction of impact, likelihood, or both in certain scenarios. The last one is retention, and then we also have an extended measure of it called exploitation. So we retain a risk. We know that the exposure is not that high for us as an organization, and we know that we might benefit a lot from this, and we want to exploit, we want to retain that risk and exploit it. Or it could be a scenario that this risk is something that you can't really do anything about. You have to work. A lot of regulatory risks come in this point because you have to live with it. You have to just manage your exposure and you have to live with it, retain it, and move on to ensure that you are able to change your mechanisms of working according to the risks materialization. Yeah, let's move on, Anupam. Now, in the next section, we will talk about certain standards, guidances that are available from various regulatory bodies, which talk about the importance of risk management and which kind of provide guiding principles on how risk management organizations or risk management teams should be structured, what should be the processes around risk management that an organization should take. The first one is what we call as the 3 lines of defense model. This doesn't really define how you do risk management. This kind of defines the roles and responsibilities across the lines of defense in the organization towards managing risks in a business. Now, we have been constantly talking about governing bodies and oversight on the risk, and this revised 3 lines model that has recently come in talks about the governing bodies and the leadership that set the tone at the top towards risk management in an organization. The first and the second lines. The first line is, of course, the business or the line functions in any organization. These people are like the soldiers who are standing at the line of control, actually facing the risks when they come in. So, from our management functions, we have, and a lot of you will be in a lot of these kind of roles where you are actually dealing with your day-to-day operations of the company. A lot of operational risks come in, and how do you deal with them? You are the ones taking decisions of how do you manage and deal with a particular risk. So and this is where most of our risk owners, mitigation owners will fall in. The second line is basically the guidance function. The recent change that has come in this model, it says that second line is also an integrated function with the first line, because you can't have guidance without having adequate skin in the game. So the idea is that you have a second line of defense which is there to provide guidance, support, monitor, and challenge the first line on risk-related matters. Their responsibility is to look at what the first line is doing and support them. They are not auditors, they are and these are generally the risk managers, chief risk officers, risk coordinators in any organization, compliance officers for that matter, because they are providing various kind of guidance to their first line functions on how do they need to deal with certain activities in the organization. The third line, which is the independent assurance function. Internal audit provides the independent assurance to the governing bodies that what's happening on the first line and the second line is adequate. We are taking our risks in the right fashion, and the second line is supporting and monitoring those risks in the right spirit. So third line is like an independent and objective assurance to assure the board, the shareholders, the governing bodies that what's happening in terms of the management's functions is adequate and the risks that we are taking are in the right spirit or not, and are we managing our risks well or not. And if we are spending any resources of the organization to mitigate risks or manage them, are they being done in the right spirit, right? Responsible people are dealing with them. So that becomes the responsibility of this independent assurance or internal audit function. Let's move to the next one, please, Anupam. COSO. Yeah. The next framework, and which is one of the most widely accepted frameworks on risk management that we've seen. We will be primarily talking about 2 frameworks. One is the COSO 2017 ERM framework, and the other is the ISO 31000 framework. So the journey, we'll start with COSO and the journey of this Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. That's what COSO stands for. COSO was set up in 1985 in the United States to sponsor a national commission on fraudulent practices. This committee this agency has been one of the leading, they have been releasing a lot of guidances and frameworks on risk management and internal controls ever since. The first ERM framework that was launched by COSO was in 2004, which for a while was used as, it was one of the primary frameworks that came in and was used as Bible for a lot of organizations who were early adopters of ERM. So this was one of the first frameworks that came in the market. Recently, in 2017, after about 13 years, they came up with a revised framework, which is now called COSO ERM 2017. And this framework is more aligned with the updated things that we are talking about in terms of how ERM is evolved as a collective organization level practice. That's how COSO has also revised their ERM framework, and it has brought in more integration of strategy and business performance management with risk management. So it's not a siloed function, is what COSO 2017 says. This framework has 5 key components, and then these 5 components are then split over about 20 principles. The first component of this framework is what is called as governance and culture. Again, the same point that we've been talking about, having a strong governance mechanism for oversight and establishing responsibilities for ERM, and a culture which is basically inculcating risk management in your organization's values and behaviors. You ensure that everybody is in the culture of the organization. Risk management is being inculcated. That's the basic principle of governance and culture. The second principle, which is what we call as strategy and objective setting, this principle talks about how we need to align our risk management practices with the strategy function or the strategy of the organization. How are we setting our risk appetite? Are we looking at risks when we are looking at doing our strategic planning process? How they are intertwined, and the idea of this component is to say that it's not an isolated function. You need to integrate it with everything in your business, and when you plan for your operations or when you plan for a new strategy, you need to look at risk. The next component is what we call as risk performance. This is where the entire process of risk is defined. How you look at risks, how is the entire identification, assessment, and prioritization happens. And this component and the pillars, the pillars under it define the process of doing risk management. The next one is review and revision, which talks about how this has to be a continuing plan, do, check, act mechanism. Risk management done once is not sufficient. You have to regularly continue to review your business vis-a-vis the risks that you had identified. Make sure that the components of risk management program are working well and functioning over a time. And that's what this component of review and revision mentions. And the last one is information and communication and reporting. This is where we have to be very cognizant of how risks and risk-related information is being reported internally as well as externally. It talks about a two-way communication, how you are taking information from external sources to look at your risk portfolio better, and how you are reporting on your risk portfolio to the external environment. So it talks about inflow as well as the outflow of information and communication with respect to risks and risk management. So next one, please, Anupam. Yeah. We spoke about the 20 principles of the COSO mechanism. This slide kind of lists down these 20 principles that are there in each of these 5 key components on how the entire governance, strategy, objective setting, performance of risk, review and revision, and the entire information, communication, and reporting will happen. Now, each of these principles in COSO have a fundamental concept that is associated with it. And when we are setting up COSO's basic guidance is that when you're setting up an enterprise risk management program, for an effective program, you need to look at individually these components and make sure that they are built into your business process in your ERM program holistically, so that you take care of each of these principles as a whole. Next one, please. So this kind of highlights what really changed between COSO 2004 to 2017. What is different now is the principles that are there, the earlier framework vis-a-vis the current framework, the principles and the components that have been defined. There is a greater emphasis on strategic value of ERM. It doesn't talk about ERM as a compliance checkbox function. It talks about value creation using risk management practices. For a very long time, risk management was looked at something that will help you protect value of the organization. this framework also says that you need to look at risk management to increase or create value for your organization. It will help you as a performance enabler and not just a compliance check in the box activity. And this has largely changed because over the last few years, we've seen that boards, their awareness and oversight on ERM was improving a lot. With various years that we dealt with risks, we managed them. The boards and the management across organizations have changed. Their lens of looking at risks has changed significantly, and that's why there was a need for this revision. And COSO came up with this new framework, and same was for ISO. ISO also devised their framework, and Anupam, if you'd like to talk about a bit on the ISO's revised framework.
So, just giving a quick background on ISO. So, ISO is a standard which was first codified in the year of 2009. And the basic principles in codification of the risk management standard is to have a common framework, and this is the most renowned and acceptable framework across the world. So, as if I compare it with COSO is prominently US dominated, but ISO is a standard which is, if I say it's adopted in Australia, New Zealand, India, Europe. So, it has a wider reach. The rationale behind ISO as a standard having a wider reach is it's a little simpler than the COSO framework, and it's like going back to the roots. So if I would like to just divide the section of ISO 31000, and it was revised in the year of 2018, and in the revised standard we have the three major components, which is the principles, framework, and the process. In the principles section, it has basically the 8 principles that should be considered by an organization when they are implementing the risk management framework. Again, we will find a lot of things which we have spoken in our earlier slide coming again over here, because most of the standards which have been adopted has the flavor of ISO 31000. The first principle is integration. So risk management should be integral part of all the organization activities. It should be integrated with the various functions, various activities across the organization in a structured manner. And in order to be effective, it should be comprehensively applied. The approach of risk management should be applied across the organization. Another principle that should be taken into consideration is the customization. We cannot have one standard approach that needs to be applied to all the companies. The framework has to be customized as per the requirement for your state of operation in proportionate to your activities. The last is inclusiveness. It's very important that a risk management framework in an organization to be successful, that you have all the stakeholders participate or be the owner through the process. So the inclusiveness and in the involvement of all the stakeholders, because every stakeholder in the organization has their own set of knowledge and expertise in their field. So it's important that we involve everyone in the risk management process. The next principle is about the dynamic in nature. The whole process has to be dynamic, because at the end we are responding to an environment which is itself dynamic. So the emerging trends, the predictiveness of the environment should be factored in when we are designing the framework for the organization. The next principle talks about the best available information. So when we are identifying the risk or the process we are implementing for evaluation of the risk, it should not be just based on the current set of data. It should take into consideration the historical as well as the future trends. So the risk we identify for today, for the future, should take into consideration the historical as well as the future trends. So it should be a mix of the best available information. The next principle is the human and cultural factor. For me, or for any organization, this is one of the most important principle, because it talks about the risk culture of the organization. Because at the end, it's the people of the organization who is going to implement the process on the ground. So the culture of the organization should significantly influence would significantly influence the implementation of the process. So we should factor in the culture of the organization when we are designing the process for risk management. And the last is the continual improvement. So once we have designed the process of the organization, so we should have a mechanism in place so we learn from our mistake and continuously improve our risk management process. So taking into consideration what we will achieve. So as Dipti spoke about in the COSO framework, it's not just about preserving the value, it's also about creating a value. Again, the ISO framework is again getting back to the value creation and protection. The next framework, this has been broadly covered in the previous section, but just to focus on the framework, these are the broad 6 areas which you should consider when you're designing the framework, which is the integration. Again, it should be integrated, and there has to be a commitment from the top management when they are implementing the framework. The design of the framework should take into consideration the internal and the external factor. And during the implementation, it should also enable that how the risk influencing the decision making of the organization. Next is the evaluation. You should have the evaluation parameter, whether your mitigation plan is getting implemented on the ground or not. And again, the improvement factor. Your whole process and the framework should improve as per the change in the internal and the external environment. Next is the process. This is almost similar to what we had discussed, the 4 or 5 step process, which starts with setting up the scope and context and then the criteria, because at the end, for what we are identifying the risk, what are our objectives for which we are identifying the risk for the organization. The next is the risk assessment. Again, it's a 3-step process which talks about identifying, analyzing the risk and evaluating the risk. We spoke in detail in the earlier slide how to perform the risk assessment. Risk statement, again, the 4th strategy we spoke about earlier, which whether should accept the risk, mitigate the risk, share the risk, and the communication, reporting, monitoring and review. So as we can understand, a lot of things which we spoke about earlier was influenced by the ISO 31000. So if you want to just summarize how ISO 31000 has moved from 2009 to 2018, so there has been a greater focus on the iteration in the risk management framework. We need to not to be following the same framework again and again. We need to continuously evolve and change our framework in each stage of process. Also, we should focus on sustenance, because at the end, when we are implementing a process, it's very important for us to ensure that we are sustaining the process in the longer run. And it has also updated the principles of certain principles like the risk culture and others which were not there in 2009 framework, is that it has given more focus on the risk culture, the tone at the top, and as well as the top management involvement of the leadership for the risk oversight. So as we have spoken, just to summarize, we have spoken about the 3 lines model. We have spoken about COSO, ISO. So if you want to just summarize, what are the key messages that we can derive from all the 3 models and standards we have spoken about? So one thing, what are the commonality between all of the 3 frameworks? The first is the risk governance. We should have a strong risk governance. We should have the involvement of the risk committee, the board, and the chief risk officer should be involved in managing the risk. We need to bring the operational discipline, because the risk management process should be part of the business as usual. It should not be considered in isolation. It should be dynamic and it should be part of your day-to-day management process. The third is that we should have a set of risk which we should monitor on an ongoing basis, a set of corporate set of enterprise risk. Integration of the strategic risk management capability with the organization, the strategic planning and the capability, because in order to achieve our end objective, we should focus on value creation as well as value preservation. And the last thing which focuses on that, whatever we implement for an organization, the organization should also validate that whether what our objectives were for implementing ERM as a process the internal audit team should focus on checking the effectiveness of the enterprise risk management process. So it's very important that we have an independent internal audit function who see whether we are achieving our intended result or not, because implementing process is one part, but checking whether the process is effective is equally important.
Right. Now, in the next section, which is our last section for the webinar, we will, before we get into the Q&A, we will talk about, how the recent pandemic has resulted in certain eye-openers for risk management and risk manager community. There was, and how it is changing now, and what do we see that it's going to change in the next 1 to 2 to 3 years in terms of how the risk management practices will emerge. The first one, there was a recent survey that was done by Institute of Risk Management, and as a part of that global survey, they surveyed approximately 1,000 chief risk officers or equivalent in various organizations. Only of the survey participants across the globe, they said that, 32% of the participants said that they had not considered pandemic risk in their risk profile before COVID actually happened. So that means about the rest of the participants said that COVID or the pandemic, not really COVID, but a pandemic risk was there. Certain key takeaways which are important is to have better awareness and understanding of risk. Whatever role, as I was saying, whatever role you might be in any organization across the 3 lines, it's become very important that we are more aware and we understand risk in what we are doing, and that importance is going up by the hour as we speak. The idea is to also use risk management to make it's not to identify risks and then sit and say that, I'm not going to do anything because there are a lot of risks in whatever I am doing. The idea is that you become more confident and more resilient as an organization, as a business, as a team, as a function, to say that, we are aware what are the risks. We know how we really need to manage them. If not manage them, we will have some plan B ready if we are not able to manage these risks well. And thus we increase our level of resilience as a business. And the last one is basically how do you use risk management to increase your or enhance your business's performance rather than looking it as a check in the box compliance exercise. The idea is to use it to increase your rewarded risks and reduce your unrewarded risks to the extent possible, and take intelligent decisions so that you are able to improve the performance of your business, of your team, of your unit, and make sure that you are having a sustained competitive advantage over your competitors, over the other players in your ecosystem. And thus this becomes these integration of risk management in your business as usual, as well as your strategy planning process. Performance of your business, of your team, of your, to ensure that we get and make sure that you are out of having a sustained competitive advantage over your competitors, over the other players in your ecosystem. Yeah. And thus this becomes, these maybe what we would ask management in your business as usual, go back from this session, and is something that, what really is your role in managing risk in your respective organizations? We would want you all to reflect, and, we can talk about it in the Q&A session also if you have any comments or feedback for us. But really reflect in your current role, in your current responsibilities. What is it that you can do to manage risks better? How is it that you can really take up responsibilities and look at risks with a keener eye and make sure that you become, in your current capacity, a better risk manager or a risk champion? Whatever role you get in your current capacity that you are working on, how do you really manage risk? Look at your role in managing risk and manage it much, much better as an organization. I think we can open the floor for questions. Anuj sir, if you're there, we can open the floor for questions if there are any questions from the group. Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay, just a minute.
Sure. Sir, we can't hear you. Yes, sir. No, we were just, we summarized the session. You're saying if there are questions, we can start with them. Yeah. हाँ जी, screen share stop कर देते. Yes, sir. No, we were just.
Madam, there are some questions. Shall we go ahead with the questions?
Yes, sir. Please. Let's do it.
Okay. First question is, can ICAI come up with a checklist for risk management?
Sir, I think there is some, in my understanding, there is some guidance already available with the ICAI resources as a part of the risk management courses that you do. But I think you can answer this question much better than we can, but we can definitely be of assistance if such a checklist needs to be created. My point only here is that there is no standard checklist which can help you do risk management. There can be risk universes or standard certain risk guidelines that you can use for which there are frameworks available. But it's not a checklist based program. It's not like 10 pointers, and that's the entire idea of doing risk management better, which is what we have been saying, that it's not a check in the box approach. We can definitely look at the guidance that we spoke about, and whosoever is posted this question, I would suggest that you maybe look at the guidance documents that have been supplied along with COSO and the ISO frameworks. They talk about steps that you can follow to do risk management better, rather than a checklist that these are 20 risks that can come up in a business. It gives you a step-by-step approach on how to manage risks better. Because every organization will have different kind of risks, and managing them with a checklist approach will not help. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And next question is, some companies would say that the risk appetite is higher and therefore they are not going to adopt more stringent controls. They are likely to show more growth than a company adopting a more conservative approach, saying that their appetite is lower. So what are the methods through which the stakeholders would come to know this to make a well-informed decision?
Yeah. So, very good question, and thank you, whosoever raised it. I spoke about appetite and how organizations in different spheres of operations and different stages in their value chain can have their various types of risk appetite. A risk appetite is all about what is your hunger for taking risk as an organization and what is at stake. When you are, when you are in a startup mode, say tomorrow I open a startup, I will have a lot of hunger to grow. It's my money. I want to grow it, make it triple, double, triple the fastest I can. But the moment I have an investor, a shareholder who comes in, it becomes a very important point that we collectively look at risks in that business, because it is, so say tomorrow Anupam and I do a partnership. His appetite may not be as much as mine is, or the other way around. So to effectively look at risks in a risk appetite in an organization, yes, you rightly pointed out when you raised the question, certain organizations will have higher appetite. But that doesn't mean that we should circumvent our control mechanisms just because we say we have a higher appetite. In fact, with a higher appetite, you should have more control mechanisms because you're taking more risks. So just giving this suggestion, this reason that, our risk appetite is high is not a solution to, I'd say, circumvent control mechanisms or control operations, because with the higher the appetite, the more the controls, the more the monitoring mechanisms should be there in the organization. And that's what we should work towards, to make sure that the higher appetite is managed well. Yeah.
Just adding to that, you may say that you may have a higher appetite in the current circumstances, but that is not going to be the same tomorrow. Your appetite is also going to change over the life cycle of the company. So it's important that you have a robust control mechanism to ensure that whether your appetite is aligned with your strategic objective and whatever risk you're taking in alignment with the appetite of the organization, have a robust control mechanism in order to ensure that it's an informed decision making rather than which is not aligned with the objectives of the organization.
Yeah, and just to make sure that all the stakeholders are aligned with that appetite of the organization, it becomes very important that we get this approved by the board. So the appetite decision cannot be taken up by one person alone in the organization. It has to be a collective decision of the board and the leadership of the organization to make sure that everybody is aware of what kind of appetite are we dealing with and what is our tolerance level towards certain risks that we can face tomorrow. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question is, had any organization identify the risk of natural calamity like COVID at present and how to overcome the impact, especially with regard to revival of business in future?
Right. So, sir, we've seen a few organizations who had identified, as I also mentioned in my survey results, there were organizations who had identified COVID, not really COVID, pandemic as a risk or an epidemic resulting in business continuity issues. They had not identified it to the extent that we are really facing it today. But we have seen organizations who had identified that, in a particular country, there is a natural disaster or a calamity or an epidemic that comes in, and we are not able to run our supply chain or our business operations in that particular country. Or in our main country of operations, and there were business continuity plans that organizations had in terms of redundancies that had been built in their processes or alternate supply sources that had been identified. So the idea now, and since we have all learned from this pandemic, the idea will be to more improve on our crisis management mechanisms, that if this kind of an pandemic happens tomorrow, and what are some of the critical operations of our business and what kind of reserves do we really need to keep as crisis reserves, so that if tomorrow this kind of a risk again materializes. It was a scenario which was known, but really the extent of it was unknown to the world. So what we can learn from it is that how can we better prepared when it happens the next time. And now all we can do is just make sure that we look at the outcomes of this pandemic on our business. If we have not been prepared for it till now, all we can do is start preparing. It's never too late to start coming out of a scenario like this. So start looking at what really are the aftermaths of this pandemic on our business and then try and address them. Yeah, you were saying something also?
Next question.
Yeah, just go on.
Next question is from a participant from Sydney. He says, could you speak a little on first line of defense in ERM, especially in terms of banking system? For example, kind of risk to look for, how to quantify, etc. And again, he's asking a little more insight on how the risk advisory department practically works. For example, how is an assignment executed for a given risk management project? May I repeat the question again?
No. So maybe we'll split it into the two parts. Anupam, you want to talk about the banking sector a bit more? Yeah.
So as we talk about banking sector, so a little background for the wider audience. In India and across the world, the banking as a sector was the first sector which adopted risk management, and most of the banking sector has a very robust or advanced risk management framework for identifying the risk, assessing the risk, and also the advantage we get when we are executing a project from a risk advisory standpoint in a banking sector is you get a lot of data. For example, when we spoke about the assessment, the likelihood of occurrence, which is quite subjective in nature, because a risk occurring in future, which will take, let's say, 80% chance of vulnerability around that, it's pure, there's a scientific method to calculate the probability and vulnerability around that. But in a banking sector, you get an advantage because you have got a lot of data analytics through which you can do a predictive analysis around those data. You can perform scenario analysis, which will enable you as an organization from the first line perspective to first, once you have identified the risk, how to assess them. Though those data would be sitting near you, you need to first identify from the first line what is the source of those data and validate whether those data are authentic and coming from the right sources within the organization. And as a first line, it becomes quite critical, the risk associated with your department, if you're from the first line, that you have a list of those risks which from your function would have an impact on an enterprise level, and how those risks are evolving, and the assessment parameters would change. What may be a high risk as a first line in this quarter may not be a high risk in the next subsequent quarters, since the whole process is evolving due to change in the environment. So the assessment parameters which you had taken will also change as the business objectives of the organization changes in the subsequent quarter or the subsequent year. So when you are analyzing the risk from the first line, you need to consider two aspects, the short term as well as the long term. So what's your business plan for this year, and what's your long term plan and long term objectives? So there are various methods.
Yeah, some of the risks, the question was also on what kind of risks can the first line be looking at, and the categories of risks for a banking sector. Some categories that I can talk about are largely credit risk, market risk, liquidity risk, conduct risk, which has become very important in the last few years, the banking disasters that we've seen. So conduct risk becomes very important. The risk around various compliance requirements that you have in a banking setup. So the operational and compliance risks are some of the risks that the first line would look at and adequately be supported by the risk function. So as Anupam was saying, this model really has come in from the first line of the three lines of defense model was largely driven and originated somewhere in the banking environment. And these are some of the risks the first line, with support of the second line, can look at. And there was another question. I think the question was in two parts in terms of risk advisory projects that we look at. There are various natures of risk advisory projects that organizations can take, and we as consultants support them. And they are largely driven from, if you have an existing program, you look at how mature you are in terms of what can be the improvement areas, or it could be a implementation program for ERM from scratch if you're setting up your function or your processes around risk management. And we take that up, follow one of the standards available as is prescribed and is preferred by the clients or the organization, and then we start implementing using one of these frameworks. So it's ideally, I'd say, it's important that we pick up one of these frameworks so that kind of underlays the philosophy of how we want to do risk management for that particular organization. Yeah.
Next question is, who is responsible for the risk management function in the MSME sector who may not afford to have a person or team deployed for risk management activities?
Right. So in these kind of scenarios, what we've seen is that we will dedicate, and risk management responsibility actually lies with everybody. So all the department heads, the owners of businesses in MSME sectors, it will be actually the promoters and the shareholders there. So actually the risk management responsibility lies with departments individually. You may not be able to afford dedicated risk function, but that doesn't stop us from doing risk management adequately. So as I was also saying, that this pandemic has also taught us that if you don't have a risk management or risk officer or a risk management function, that doesn't mean that you can't do risk management. So risk management has to be in such kind of organizations built into our regular processes, so that everybody who's operating a business function, a business process, knows what are the risks in it and manages it better. So it becomes everybody's responsibility for any scale of business. The only added advantage in a bigger organization which can afford to have a dedicated function is that the monitoring becomes more stringent. But risk management of risk can continue even in an organization which is small and doesn't have dedicated teams to manage it. And in such scenarios, what we can do is we can dedicate a management level committee or a team of members, 2-3 members, who can actually have an oversight that the risks are being managed well. So that can be an additional responsibility for them rather than a dedicated role.
Just adding to that, in what we have seen in our practice is some of the small or the MSMEs startup, they don't have a dedicated risk management team to oversight or ensure the standards and the practices which has been followed as per the policy and the framework of the organization. So many times someone from the finance department or the CFO department delegates or keep a key person who oversees that, or someone from the internal audit department. The second line and the third line gets diluted by that, but since it's a MSME organization, you cannot have a dedicated workforce. So they take care as a responsibility to manage or to oversee the risk from an independent perspective, from managing the risk, whether the business function is adhering to the policy and framework or not.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next question is, as Chief Risk Officers, how do we enable management to achieve higher and profitable revenue by using risk appetite as a tool?
So, sir, to answer this, I think as Chief Risk Officers or risk managers for a business, we need to be involved in the strategy setting exercise of the organization and make sure that if there is an adequate risk, when the risk appetite for the organization is being laid, when there are business decisions that are taken, they are taken by measuring that appetite. And that appetite is not just a document which has been created and we are not really following it. We've seen organizations who will have a very detailed document on risk appetite, but when the business decisions are to be taken, it's always, business is priority and fine, we've taken care of the risks. That's the kind of responses we've seen functional heads give at times. So the idea is to have CRO or the risk head sit in the decision making team. And if you'll see, there is this change that has come in the lines of defense model also. It says that you should have CROs or risk managers or risk teams that support the business decision making. They have skin in the game to ensure that when the decisions are being taken, they are being taken vis-a-vis the appetite of the organization, which helps us in increase. So if we have decided on a higher risk appetite, we take more risks and have more controls to make sure that those risks really don't materialize. And every time we are defining a strategy, we weigh it against our appetite before finalizing what our decision is going to be.
Thank you. Next question is, under financial risk, one of the greatest risks is the credit risk.
Yeah.
Default by debtors. A good legal framework is required to ensure that businessmen cannot default in paying of their debts. This is important as this has a chain effect.
Yeah.
And the same, he is asking another question. Do you feel every company, at least public companies, should have a division looking after risk to be added by a VP strategy and risk? They should have a team collecting intelligence that would help in managing risk. They should give periodic inputs to the board directly.
Yeah. So the first one I think was more of a statement. I agree. Credit risk is very important for any business. And that's the reason we've seen organizations have different stands when it comes to managing credit, by getting into it, not getting into it, what kind of credits do we want to give in the market, depending on what leverage we have. Financial sector, that becomes the most important risk in the BFSI sector. The second point, which was more of a question, listed companies should have a risk management function headed by VP strategy and risk. I kind of agree that you should have, the bigger the company, you should have a dedicated risk function. And if you see the Kotak committee recommendations on the LODR, which have now been adopted, they've also spoken about the importance of a risk management committee of the board and them looking at what risk management activities are happening in the organization. So they've also said that board should have a direct oversight on the risk management practices, and we agree. It's a leading practice that you should have your risk functions directly present to the risk management committee or the board on the risk matters, independent of the management. So I agree.
Similarly, on the same lines, another question is, there will always remain an element of subjectivity in risk ratings.
Right.
What I consider as high impact risk may be seen as a low impact risk by management or vice versa. How
Right.
to deal with such scenario?
Just to answer that question, there are multiple ways where I agree with the scenario where there is a subjectivity involved in assessment of the risk. But what we call in our practice is the cross-functional assessment of the risk, because at times when you are assessing the risk individually, those risks are assessed in a cross-functional department. We do a workshop where people from various departments get together and collectively deliberate on the assessment of the risk, why that risk should be rated as high, medium and low, and come to a common ground whether it should be high and low. And we also have a top-down and bottom-up approach. So whatever risk gets assessed at the bottom of the pyramid also is looked after, whether that's a high risk or a medium risk, by the top management. So both the methods, the top-down, bottom-up, as well as the cross-functionality, reduces the subjectivity, because at the end we should try to quantify the risk as much as possible based on data available. So there is a certain set of limitation, but there are methods to minimize the subjectivity in the assessment of the risk.
Yeah.
And next question is a very important, a practical question. He says that I, as an entrepreneur, had planned for any unseen adverse to my business. Well, he has planned anything which is adverse to the business, but I have lost lot of customers because they had not prepared for any adverse effect. How to address this issue?
Yeah, and very important aspect, and I think we touched upon it. It's called as the extended enterprise risk. When you are looking at one of the concepts that has emerged now is that you can't look at risks in isolation of your organization. You will have external dependencies in form of customers, in form of vendors who are very critical to your business. And this question would rightly also stand for maybe some of your key vendors, because they have gone down and you are not able to run your business, or the customers have gone down and you are not able to supply. So when we are looking at risks, we need to also see the dependency that we have on some of our key customers. Are we having a concentration risk on certain few customers who are really looking at my, looking after my business? So I would say we should, when you are looking at risk management, not just look at your organization in isolation, but also this becomes a very important risk for you, that were you really concentrated with a few key customers, and because of that, if they go down, because of a scenario like this, we may not be able to pick up our business because we were so dependent. So that concentration risk is something that you need to look at when you're looking at your organization's risk. That is something that was maybe missed at. And how do you make sure that you don't have extreme dependency on a few customers for sustaining your business?
No, there are some more questions. With your permission, shall I continue?
Yes, sir. We are happy to continue. Yes, sir. Please.
Thank you. Another question is, how can a CA build their career in risk management? Can you tell us any certificate or any course which they can do?
Yeah. So I would say there are multiple certifications available in the market. There are certifications on ISO as well as COSO standards. Anupam is a certified risk professional, and there is a certification called Financial Risk Management, or the FRM, which is available. So there are various certifications available in the market. Certified Risk Management and Assurance Professional, which is something that we have seen a lot of chartered accountants do, because it talks about risk management and assurance over risk management a lot. So, and what we can do is, sir, we can share the list of available certifications with you, and if you'd like, you can circulate it in the group. But there are multiple risk management related certifications available in the market. And I would say you really don't need a certification in risk management to develop a career in risk management. Chartered accountants have the knowledge of business, how a business functions and the business operations. And I think that can itself be leveraged. And I'll have maybe Anupam talk a bit more on it, because Anupam is a chartered accountant and he has been in this space for a while. He recently got certified, but he had built a career in risk management much before that.
So, just adding to that, recently there was a survey by an institute by a body in Europe. The name of the body was Firma, and they had a very specific question around what is the value or what is the advantage you get when you get a certification around that. So if you are exploring risk management as your career, certification is an add-on advantage. I won't say that it won't nullify your advantage. It will just give you a stepping stone. So what would be critical would be that get a more hand-on practice to it. How to resolve a risk scenario, what could be the added scenarios around that. And definitely in the longer run, you may get advantage because you are a certified risk professional, but it should be a mix of practice as well as certification. Alone, one certification will just a boost in a later part of a career, but initially you should focus more on developing a practice around it, what is risk, developing and building your career so that your base and your roots are clear.
Yeah, and nowadays I think there are a lot of courses available online which you can enroll in, not very expensive courses as well, and gain more understanding on risk management frameworks and the processes on risk management.
Another very important question. What would you tell the MD, CEO or owner of a large corporate who says that I know all the risks afflicting my business and organization and I am on top of them and I don't need any external expert to tell me what my risks are and mitigation should be?
So I would answer it one part, I would suggest that MD to call top 10 senior executives in the boardroom, take down a piece of paper and ask all the 10 people to list down their top 5 risks and see whether what top 5 risks the MD had imagined in his checklist or in his book is commonality, is everyone thinking this top 10, and that will itself become a risk because mostly the response from the top 5 executive would be completely different and there would not be a common ground where the key people, the top leader of the organization would not be speaking in the same risk language. What could be a risk for one person not be the risk, because at the end that MD is working for that organization benefits, the top leaders are working for the organizational benefits, and for the organization the top 5 risks should be understood not by MD, even the top 5 leaders of the organization as well.
And I would say, sir, to another point to this question, I would agree with the MD that yes, you would know your top risks in your business very well. Nobody knows it better than maybe you do. You don't need an external consultant every time to come and tell you. The point is share it with everyone else. The point is that you inform the others in your organization so that they also understand those risks well. There is nowhere in the risk management book it says that you need an external consultant to come and tell you what your risks are. But you definitely need to share that risk information and have a common ground on what is risk to the MD may not be risk to the CFO or the sales head or the marketing head. So have a common understanding, make sure that everybody understands it, and then you can move forward with it. You may not want to have an external consultant, but make sure that you all are aware of it. As Anupam said, call the top 5 management team members and make sure that their and your understanding is common. Yeah. So we can move to the next question. There is one.
That will be the last question. Afterwards, I welcome Vice Chairman Sir P. Rajendra Kumar ji to this webinar. So the last question is, in public sector organization, it takes time to reframe their policies to face operational, financial and other systems to mitigate the risks. What are your suggestions?
Sir, it takes time to get the buy-in on policies and frameworks to be changed. But we've worked for a lot of public sector organizations, and especially my focus has been a lot in the public sector domain in the last 5-6 years. And we've seen organizations in the public sector do good on risk management processes. You may not be able to quickly change your policy, but through regular trainings, through regular workshops, through dedicated risk management teams, we have seen a few public sector organizations run very successful risk management programs. Another important thing that we have seen is that people use technology a lot. So we've seen tools like workflow tools, and because there is a lot of change in the roles and responsibilities and people keep on getting transferred in public sector organizations, have a dedicated risk function and utilize more technology-driven solutions to be able to store that knowledge. So if it is coming in from one person who gets transferred tomorrow, have that data trail ready and have more technology-driven solutions to manage risk and monitor them better. Because you're going to be spread out across the country with so many locations, with so many people, it's better that you involve. A lot of functional involvement is required by having risk champions or risk owners embedded in different departments, and they work closely with the risk management team. But yes, I do agree, policy changes and framework changes do take time. So it is a lot of times advisable that we have a risk management committee which meets regularly, so that if there are changes that are coming in from external environment, we can quickly adopt them. We can present them to the board and quickly adopt them.
Also, what we have seen as a practice in the PSU is that they develop a policy, implement it. So every 2 or 3 years down the line, they also perform a independent refresh workshop exercise, so that the framework is not stagnant and it's aligned with the change in the environment as well. So every public sector organization go through the refresh workshop to understand what's the maturity level and take a step-by-step process in order to enhance the practice.
Right.
Thank you. Now may I request Honorable Vice Chairman, sir, of the committee, CAP Rajendra Kumar ji, to offer formal vote of thanks to both the speakers. Honorable Vice Chairman, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, you have to unmute. Vice Chairman, sir, you have to unmute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you, Dr. Surendra Palji, for inviting me on this particular program. In fact, I apologize to the speakers, Deepti Madam and Anupam ji, because I was a little late. I joined late as I had other works of my committee of which I am the chairman, and hence I could not log in at the beginning moment itself. But then nevertheless, I was here for almost about 45 minutes or so, and was hearing the presentation of Deepti Madam and also the question answer session which both the speakers have very nicely deliberated upon. In fact, the topic of enterprise risk management is always an evergreen topic, and in these COVID times, especially when the risks not only for the enterprise but also for the human life is at stake, whatever that we safety measures that we have to take, that I think all of us are taking, all the members who are online must be taking. And to these speakers who have spared their valuable time, CA Anupam ji and Deepti Madam, sincere gratitude to you, sincere thanks to you for enlightening us. In fact, as you would know, our participants were from across the borders also, far from our country. And that speaks volumes of your contribution in terms of this particular program. And also, our sincere thanks to the Honorable Chairman Anuj Goyal ji, who is spearheading this committee and also ensuring that the knowledge upgradation and the hand-holding of chartered accountants and of all the stakeholders continues unabated, in spite of the fact that the entire humanity is in a very, very typical situation of lockdown. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for inviting us.
Vice Chairman, sir, and thank you to both the speakers, Deepti Madam and Anupam ji, for sharing their valuable time, knowledge and experience with all our participants. And
Thank you so
to
much.
participants also.
Please
Thank you.
be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Palji and your team, please be safe. Please be safe.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.